Okay, let's unpack this. There's this fundamental human drive, isn't there? This sort of restless quest to understand the natural world, not just, how to survive in it, but to really know its secrets. What makes a healing plant actually heal? What power is hidden in a stone or a dewdrop?
It's that ancient curiosity, yeah, that real hunger to kind of decipher nature's language, to see meaning woven into everything.
And today, our deep dive, it comes from the introduction to this really fascinating book exploring one way humanity tried to answer that. It's a system based on, well, intuitive wisdom, observation,
hmm
but maybe not how we think of observation today.
Right. It stems from this core belief
Mm.
that everything around us, plants, minerals, animal parts, you name it, they carry these visible resemblances, signatures, they call them.
Signatures.
And these weren't seen as random. They were thought to be deliberate signs pointing to a hidden purpose, often medicinal or some connection to the bigger picture.
Right, like seeing a particular shape in a plant, maybe, and believing that shape tells you it's good for a specific part of the body.
Exactly that. Or the color, perhaps. And the source we're looking at presents this with a really unique, almost mythical framing.
Yeah, talking about a great eye, observing time, and addressing you, the listener, directly, it adds this narrative layer.
hmm And that narrative approach really highlights the book's main point.
Mhm.
This system, the doctrine of signatures, it wasn't just scattered folk tales. The source makes a pretty strong case that it was, pervasive, complex, philosophically coherent even,
Mm.
deeply rooted in certain worldviews.
And crucially, not just some historical side note. It actually shaped early modern scientific thinking quite profoundly before being replaced, and yet the source argues its spirit still echoes today in surprising ways.
Absolutely. So our mission really in this deep dive is to journey through this whole system of thought. We'll use the source as our roadmap to understand its origins, how they actually interpreted these signs, why it eventually faded, and what bits of it might still resonate.
It's just so easy, isn't it, from our modern perspective, steeped in empirical science, to just label it superstition. But the source is pushing us to look beyond that easy dismissal, to see the sophisticated intellectual ground it held for centuries.
Exactly. It's about understanding their mindset, the questions they were asking. Different from ours, sure, but leading to their own kind of systematic inquiry.
Okay, so let's follow the source's path, starting right at the beginning. The philosophical foundations. What made this doctrine even conceivable?
Well, the source starts there, explaining it didn't just appear out of thin air. It grew from these really deep roots in ancient ways of seeing the universe.
You mean things like Plato's ideas and the revival of Hermetic thought during the Renaissance? These weren't just abstract ideas, were they?
Not at all, not in practice. At their core was this belief that the universe itself was a grand living entity, not just a collection of separate things, but a vast interconnected web, pulsating with life full of hidden connections. Sympathies, they call them.
A living universe. Wow, that completely changes how you'd look at a plant or a stone, doesn't it?
It changes everything, because if the universe is one big, interconnected organism, then it kind of follows that every part must somehow mirror the whole. This is that core concept of correspondence, the idea that connections existed based on unseen forces or shared qualities.
Oh, so a thing on Earth wasn't just a thing on Earth. It was potentially reflecting cosmic forces or divine intentions or mirroring other parts of the universe. The world was full of signs.
Precisely. And that philosophical groundwork was absolutely essential for the doctrine of signatures to even make sense, let alone take hold.
Okay, so we have that philosophical basis, this living, interconnected universe filled with correspondences. How did the doctrine itself evolve over time? Where did it really start to flourish?
The source traces that historical path. It shows it wasn't static, it had early forms, hints of it, way back in classical antiquity, and it sort of simmered along quietly through the medieval period.
But it sounds like the Renaissance was its real moment.
Oh, absolutely. The source calls it an explosion, its glorious apotheosis. That was the era it truly became a dominant way of understanding the natural world, especially for medicine.
And we're not just talking about village healers here, are we? The source mentions some pretty significant figures involved.
Yeah, definitely not just folklore. You have people like the mystic Jacob Boehme and the revolutionary physician Paracelsus, both deeply influenced by it or actively promoting aspects of it.
Paracelsus, right. Big name.
Huge. And we also can't forget the role of the great herbalists of that time.
The ones compiling those massive books of plants and their uses.
Exactly. They were key. They integrated the doctrine of signatures right into their popular herbals books, filled with illustrations, descriptions, and the supposed virtues of plants based on these signatures. That really brought the idea into widespread use, made it accessible to practitioners and the public alike.
So you've got this deep philosophical background, a long history, and then this Renaissance peak where prominent thinkers and practical herbalists embrace it. Now, let's get to the core of it. How did they actually read these signs? What were they looking for on a practical level?
Right, this is where it gets really interpretive. It was all about reading nature's language, looking for those visible signs, those resemblances.
And the source lists different types of signatures, doesn't it? It wasn't only about shape.
No, not just shape. There were morphological signatures, shape and form, chromatic ones based on color, textural ones relating to touch, even ecological ones like where a plant grew or how it behaved.
Okay, let's use those classic examples the source gives. They really make it click. The walnut, for instance.
The walnut, yes.
Yeah.
It's the go-to example. The kernel looks remarkably like a tiny human brain, doesn't it? With the two hemispheres, the folds.
It really does.
So according to the doctrine, that was a clear sign. Nature, or the creator, telling you walnuts were meant for ailments of the head and brain.
Simple as that.
Hmm.
And the yellow flower.
Right. A plant with bright yellow flowers like celandine, maybe, or dandelion, was believed to help the liver
Why the liver?
because the liver was associated with yellow bile in the old humoral theory. So the yellow flower's color was seen as the signature, the link.
So they literally looked at the outside, the shape, or the color, and saw it as a direct instruction manual for what it could treat inside the human body.
That's the fundamental idea, yes. These weren't coincidences to them. They were deliberate signs indicating hidden medicinal properties or an affinity for a specific illness. It was like mapping the visible natural world onto the internal landscape of the body.
And the source really emphasizes that while these examples sound simple, almost naive to us now, the system itself rested on that complex philosophical foundation we talked about. It wasn't just superficial.
Exactly. For believers, the outward form was a genuine window into the thing's essential nature and its purpose in the grand scheme.
But systems change, don't they? Ways of seeing the world evolve. What started to challenge this whole framework?
And that's the next turn in the story, according to the source. It moves into what happened when a fundamentally new way of understanding the world began to emerge.
The scientific revolution. And the source highlights empirical reductionism as the key shift, right?
That's it precisely. If the doctrine of signatures saw the world as, I don't know, a kind of symbolic poem to be interpreted holistically, the scientific revolution started treating it more like a machine or an equation to be broken down, measured, quantified.
That's a fundamental clash in approach. Instead of looking for symbolic links and cosmic sympathies, the new thinking was about isolating parts, rigorous observation, experiments, measuring things.
And this new scientific methodology just systematically undermined the very basis of the doctrine of signatures. The tools and disciplines that were advancing were the ones contributing to its decline.
The source mentions key figures like Bacon and Descartes.
Their emphasis on, systematic doubt, empirical proof, separating mind and matter, it pushed inquiry away from symbolic readings toward mechanistic explanations.
And specific scientific fields just started offering completely different explanations or ignored the doctrine's logic altogether.
Right. Take anatomy. As it developed, the focus shifted dramatically to the internal structure and function of organs. External shape became much less relevant for understanding disease.
And the microscope.
Huge impact. Suddenly you could see incredible detail invisible before. It suggested the really important stuff wasn't necessarily obvious on the surface, wasn't in those broad shapes or colors.
And chemistry started looking at substances completely differently, too.
Exactly. Chemistry began investigating the actual chemical makeup of plants and minerals, searching for active compounds. A level of analysis the doctrine simply couldn't access or account for.
So the new tools, the new methods, the whole new philosophical mindset, there just wasn't room for reading symbolic shapes anymore.
It started to look subjective, unprovable, unreliable, compared to controlled experiments or anatomical dissection. And the source makes that critical point here. Modern science often just writes it off as mere superstition.
But the argument is that misses its historical significance.
Completely. Calling it mere superstition ignores the fact that it was a complex, coherent way of knowing within its own context. It wasn't just ignorance. It was a different framework for understanding. And it actually influenced early scientific inquiry before the new paradigm fully took over.
Understanding why it faded seems just as important as understanding why it flourished for so long. But the source doesn't just leave it there, does it? It talks about a legacy. echoes.
No, it doesn't end with the decline. The source definitely looks beyond that, exploring where let's say, the spirit of the doctrine might still linger today.
Where would you even look for echoes of that kind of thinking, reading nature for meaning?
Well, one clear area is ethnobotany
Hmm.
and various traditional knowledge systems around the globe. While the source mainly focuses on Europe, it does acknowledge that similar symbolic ways of linking plants to uses based on observation exist in many cultures.
Okay, so it perhaps persisted in some traditional practices, but in the modern scientific West, that seems like a bigger jump.
It is a jump, but the source suggests that the fundamental impulse behind it, the human desire for connection, for finding meaning or usefulness in nature's forms, it finds new, sometimes surprising expressions. Think about modern biomimicry, for example.
Biomimicry, you mean like
Yeah.
engineers copying nature's designs, Velcro from burrs, that kind of thing,
Yeah.
or aerodynamic shapes?
Exactly. Now, obviously, the methodology is totally different. It's rooted in rigorous analysis, testing, physics, not symbolic interpretation. But that core impulse, looking closely at nature's forms and structures for clues about function, efficiency, solutions to human problems.
Mm.
There's a resonance there, isn't there? It's like a modern, empirically validated echo of that old idea that nature's forms hold secrets relevant to us.
That's a really interesting connection. What about more abstractly?
The source points towards broader, holistic thinking approaches that emphasize interconnectedness over just breaking things down. That resonates with the doctrine's view of a web of life. And maybe even subtly, the acknowledged power of belief and placebo in health, which likely played a role in the doctrine's perceived success back then, too.
So the specific system was superseded by science, fair enough, but that underlying human instinct to see patterns, find connections, derive meaning from the natural world that's still very much alive.
Yeah, finding outlets everywhere from traditional medicine to, like you said, cutting-edge engineering. It shows that impulse to learn from nature is pretty deep and enduring.
And that brings us towards the end of this deep dive, then. We follow the source's journey through the doctrine of signatures, from its roots in that idea of a living, connected universe, through its peak during the Renaissance,
Through its challenge and decline, with the rise of the scientific revolution's focus on measurement and reduction.
and right up to exploring its surprising persistence in traditional knowledge and these subtle echoes in modern thought, like biomimicry.
Definitely wasn't just simple folk belief. It was this really sophisticated attempt within its own framework to read a universe they believed was full of intentional signs.
And this deep dive, really guided by our source, helps you understand not just a fascinating piece of intellectual history, but one of the profound ways humanity has tried to make sense of itself and its place in nature.
Yeah, it makes you appreciate how much our perspective has shifted, but also maybe how some fundamental human responses to the natural world haven't changed all that much.
Which leads us nicely into a final thought for you, the listener. It's inspired by a reflection exercise mentioned in the source called the Dragon Trial.
We invite you to try this yourself. Find a complex pattern in nature somewhere. Look closely. It could be anything, the way a tree branches, the veins on a leaf, cracks in dry mud, swirls in water, maybe a spider's web.
First, just try to describe it objectively. What shapes, lines, colors, textures do you actually see?
Then shift your viewpoint. Ask yourself, what does this pattern resemble? What other things in nature does it remind you of? What abstract ideas might it bring to mind? Maybe growth, decay, connection, flow, complexity, resilience.
And finally, just think about that shift in perception. Was it easy or hard to move from just describing the pattern to finding these other meanings or resemblances in it?
Why do you think that basic human ability, that tendency to see patterns and make analogies, might have made a system like the doctrine of signatures feel so intuitive, so logical for such a long time? Something to maybe ponder the next time you find yourself really looking at the world around you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the echoes of a cosmic design.
See you next time.